Welcome to Fitch Painting Repairs Garage. Today's project, a little bit of an update on Eleanor over here. We got the carburetor off, verified the ignition system, verified the charging system, and show you what we found in the carburetor. So we got carburetor removed from the bike, and this is what we found. This is the carburetor that we got removed from the bike. This was the other carburetor that the owner had given me, stated that that carburetor had been previously installed on the bike. And so I don't know if this was the original carburetor that was on the bike. It definitely shows signs of having been on a bike for a little bit. I'm not certain if this is the one that was on it for long term or what the situation is, but they're both aftermarket Mikuni style carburetors. But this one here is a 45 millimeter, and this one over here is a 42 millimeter. And so, we did verify that, it had a 45 on it. The owner thought that possibly the previous shop had put an oversized carburetor on it, and it definitely is. And I'm going to show you real quick on how to measure your carburetor. This is the throat side of the carburetor. This is the part that mounts to the intake manifold of the engine. And using the inside jaws, the little pointed inside jaws, this is the outside diameter jaws, this is inside diameter jaws. We're measuring inside diameter of the spigot or throat side. Put that in there, measure it, verify it, okay, and then read it, and she's a 45. We'll check this one over here, verify this one as well. Put the inside diameter jaws in, the throat, measure, check. She's 42. And some problem that we were having with that particular carburetor, the owner of the bike had stated that she was leaking fuel. And back to the mid-range performance issues that was on the bike. And so we pulled the bike down to verify all that. And I can't find anything inside the carburetor. Carburetor's pretty pristine inside. Clean, there was no debris in it. Just this was the carburetor that was on it. That's the slide inside moving around. It makes a lot of noise when it moves around. And then I also noticed where his throttle cable hooks up, he's missing the little piece. I'll show you on the other one here. See how he built this little bracket to put the throttle cable in? You should have this little setup here. It's all, you're supposed to have two cables come in. You got this little wheel, and then it attaches to your throttle plate thing. Supposed to have a throttle cable and an idle cable. Bike's only got one cable on it right now. And this is the carburetor's on it, so he built this little bracket to hold the cable. It was working. But so we're unable to verify anything on this. We pulled it apart, looked at the main jet, looked at the idle jet, the needle, and all that stuff. Everything's unmarked. There's no marks in it at all. Now this one here has been rejetted, and it has a key-in main jet in here in a Mikuni style carburetor. So, a key-in main jet. So maybe that's one of the reasons why this one wasn't running so good. Who knows? But the choke cable's damaged. So, but these could be good carburetors. They're just noisy, real noisy. They make a lot of noise. So, but we ordered another one. It's coming in the mail. We're actually going to put a HSA 42 millimeter Mikuni flat side carburetor on that. It's an actual Mikuni. This does actually have a Mikuni intake on it, and that spigot or rubber flange there is a HS42, same as the new one that I purchased. They just, from what I gathered, is they heated it up somehow, and heat gun, I don't know what they did, boiled it, heated it up, got it hot and pliable, and then pressed it over top the spigot of the 45. She wasn't leaking. I verified there was no intake manifold leaks when I was working on it, but it did not have a clamp on it. See how this one has a little thin clamp that goes around, helps hold that in place. But really, the way that you bolt these on with the breather plate, the backing plate on the breather, is actually pushes the carburetor up on that and help hold it in place. That hose clamp doesn't do anything except for when she's vibrating, keeps it from breaking loose and creating a leak. And that could be what was causing the mid-range problems, you know, as the motor shaking and vibrating around, that carburetor was developing a little leak every once in a while. It's possible. I'm thinking it's probably just overjetted. You know, so it was just too much fuel. And the reason we really got the carb apart and off of the bike was because, you know, the owner said she was spilling fuel off the carburetor with the bike not running and with the bike running. So what was going on is, I believe that the float jet, this is your float needle jet, this is the brass housing that goes in it, and the little jet that sits down in it. You replace the whole thing as a unit usually, and that fits down in here underneath that. And you got this little float bob here with a tab that holds onto the spring valve, and as the float, you know, this carburetor sits in there, it's just like this, and as your fuel fills up the float bowl, which is attaches here, it's missing on this carburetor, fills up that bowl and pushes the valve up, the float bob, and closes the valve off. And as you're riding and it drains the fuel down, it opens the valve and keeps it at a preset height. And what happens is, if this float bob is adjusted so that it doesn't shut the fuel off until it's completely full, well, then you have an overflow, spill overflow on these style carburetors. You know, this little spigot here is attached to a tube that goes up, and when the float bowl fills up to a certain point, it runs out that tube and that hose. Now, on other carburetors, your CVs and whatnot, that little thing's got a set screw in it, and it's a drain, not an overflow. It's a drain, and so you got to pull that screw loose, draining fuel out. And so what ends up happening is, if that float bob is too full, it overfills and comes up through the main jet and spills out. And it can do that as well with this one, you know, because your overflow spigot's only so far, and you know, your jet, so more fuel will come in than can get out. And so what ends up happening is it overflows into the throat of the carburetor, and if the bike's on the side stand leaning back, then that fuel runs into the intake manifold, down through the valves and the head, and eventually ends up down in the crankcase. And when I did the 10K service on this last, the oil was over full, and the customer had stated that the previous shop had put synthetic oil in the bike, which is a no-no on this bike. You don't want to run synthetic oil in this particular machine, because gasket tolerances aren't good enough for the small molecules of the synthetic, and so she'll leak in places that she normally doesn't leak in. But I think what was happening was the gas was overflowing into the intake and filling up the crankcase. Oil was over full. And part of the problem is I had checked on this bike. This is a 96 Dyna Wag Glide, a 1996 Dyna Wag Glide. This is an Evo motor. This bike has a active recall on the fuel petcock. And now normally the fuel petcock is a vacuum operated petcock on this bike. Since there's a recall on it, most ones that you come across have had it changed out. And if they haven't changed it out to another vacuum operated petcock, you got this regular petcock, and then you got a full 5-gallon tank gas pushing on that tiny little brass this tiny little valve in this brass seat, and it can overcome that and leak. So you always have to shut your fuel off when you're not riding this style of petcock. You know, just always shut it off and keep that from happening. So, just as a heads up, we'll be getting a 42 millimeter McCooney carburetor in the mail, hopefully here pretty soon, and we'll get that put on here. And then when we put it back on, get it fired up, get the carburetor dialed in, and then we're gonna go put some miles on this thing. You know, the customer had stated, you know, keep it for a little bit, ride it. I told him, I said, well, I'll probably take it out and put 150 miles on it in a day for an afternoon ride. And see how she rides. Maybe take it for 2 or 3 day ride, you know, here and there. Like I'll take it out for a nice long ride, bring it back, shut it off, put it in the garage, leave it overnight, get it out the next day, or maybe leave it 2 days, and then come back and ride it again, because that's kind of how the owner rides the bike. You know, he's a weekend rider usually. Sometimes he doesn't ride it. He owns 3 bikes, so sometimes he doesn't get a chance to ride this bike for a while. So she'll sit, you know, he'll ride his other bikes. So, and then she sat even more because she wasn't running right. And we'll see if we can't get it dialed in, get the carburetor tuned on it, get that. We'll try to figure it out. So, stay tuned.